You. Well, good morning and welcome everyone. I'm Alison from the Southern Cross Postgraduate Association. Nice to see you all here for another workshop with Patrick Danaher. So Patrick today is going to talk to us about writing an excellent critical review. Now, it was aimed at master's students, but we did open it out to all students, master's, coursework and research. So good to see a wide range of people. I'll post a few links in the chat box in a minute about the recording. We'll go to our YouTube channel, and I encourage you to become a member of the Postgraduate Association. It's free and it keeps all these sort of workshops going. So nice to see you all. Thank you. Yeah, it's all yours, Patrick. Thank you.
Thanks, Alison, and good morning, everyone. And Alison, just to double check whether you can see my title slide, please.
You can, yes.
Okay, that's always a relief.
Yes, good.
Thanks so much. All right, and good morning, everyone. It's great to be with you again, and I really compliment Alison and other colleagues and all the members for the Southern Cross Postgraduate Association. I'm very impressed by it, from the YouTube channel to the website, to these workshops. There's so much going on. So huge commendations and congratulations to everyone involved. All right, so in terms of writing an excellent critical review, what I want to do here is to build on the previous workshop, writing an excellent critical reflection. And just before we get into the essence of the workshop, if we think about it, and I'm sure you know, there are lots of ways we can differentiate between critical reflection and critical review. But the way that I think about it is that critical reflection can be a skill, it can be a disposition, it can be a graduate attribute, and so on. And it takes a number of different forms. And in terms of the assessment for the postgraduate courses at Southern Cross University, obviously across different disciplines, there are lots of assessment pieces that ask you or require you to write critical reflections as part or as the whole thing. So I see, by contrast, critical review as particularly a longer kind of piece that is possibly made up of a number of critical reflections. So there's a difference, for me, there's a difference of scale and of depth in the critical review. And so there's some of the things I'd like to talk about today. All right. Okay, so in terms of the acknowledgement of country, on behalf of Empowering Editing, we, that is Empowering Editing, acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we meet today, including in our area, the Jagera, Jayabal and Jarawa people of the Toowoomba region, where we are located, and we pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. And every time I do this, I like to include a different photograph. And this one is from the Peacehaven Botanic Park in Highfields, north of Toowoomba, and I was just sharing with Alison, some family members visited last weekend, and among other places we went here. Now, it's the Indigenous part of this is very strong. It's not entirely Indigenous, but if we just have a look at the photograph, we can see lots of native plants and so on, and it's not in the photo, but it's really well curated by local Indigenous people. So if you ever get to Toowoomba and Highfields, I thoroughly recommend it. All right, in terms of what I want to cover today, the overview of the presentation, grateful thanks, a couple of crucial caveats about me, the abstract I thought about excellent, and then they're more or less standard pieces for each workshop. Although obviously the abstract varies and so on. But then getting into the essence of the workshop about writing a critical review, I want to spend a little bit of time on defining critical reviews and what are their defining features and key characteristics and so on. Then I've got a few ideas and strategies for engaging with the selected text. And so as we know, those of you who have completed or are completing a critical review, a lot of that relates to what is the text, or what are the texts that you're reviewing, that you're looking at. And so here are some strategies for a helicopter view, overview, engagement with the selected text, but also for taking a deep dive into that selected text and what are the different things that you can be looking for. And then summarizing and paraphrasing for the critical review. Now, sometimes we might think, well, that's obvious, or I don't really need to think about that. But actually, it's good. I find, even at my advanced age, it's good to go back to these skills, these fundamental techniques of analysis, and to re-engage with what is intended by summarizing and by paraphrasing. Then some general criteria for evaluating the texts. And then I tried to do this last time with the critical reflections, and Alison was excellent again, as always, in sending through an Excel file of participants, so I could see the range of disciplines and schools at SCU that you come from. And so I've done my best to find examples from a range of different disciplines and professions of completed critical reviews. Now, in some cases, they're I guess, extended extracts from published or completed critical reviews. In other cases, they're indicative at the different phases of the critical review. So anyway, see what you think when we get to that point. A concluding note of encouragement, which is really, really important, because I find whether people are writing a thesis or completing a major project or writing a critical review or indeed reflection, sometimes we can get overwhelmed by thinking about what are all the things that I need to cover. And actually, part of this presentation, but also all of your conversations with your the academics working with you and so on, are really about demystifying this process. So it should not be mysterious. There's nothing, it's not secret academic business. On the contrary, it's about making explicit the code or the rules of the game so that you know exactly what you're being asked to produce and how to do so. All right. So I really do mean this. Alison is terrific, and everyone who works with her knows that. She actually suggested this topic, which is terrific, because obviously many postgrad students and some thesis students would be going through this process, and also shared some really great resources. And again, the association and also all of you. So thank you, everyone. All right, this is really important. So I say this about whether it's literature review or about critical reflection or about critical reviews, but it's really important to reiterate, and that is there are many equally legitimate ways to research, structure, and write critical reviews. And so there's nothing predetermined or preset, although there are disciplinary differences which we'll come to later in the session. And this is really important. So anything that I say here that inadvertently contradicts or seems to contest advice you've already been given, that's certainly not intended, and always go with the advice, experience, and knowledge of the people who are working with you and are assessing your work. All right, so a little bit about me. Previously at those two universities, I'm currently working as a wholly online or remote worker with Excelsior College in Sydney. I'm a qualitative education researcher. One of the things that is causing me sleepless nights at the moment, I'm co-editing a handbook about autoethnography and self-study. And it was one of those things, it's a great idea at the time, but as the deadline, which is the 24th of this month, comes closer, when we have to send through at least 30 polished chapters and so on, it's all a bit stressful and so on. Anyway, that's a digression. Okay, but I am really interested in how these kinds of assessment tasks, critical reviews and so on, simultaneously function generically across disciplines, but they also look and feel differently within those disciplines. And when we get to the discipline-specific examples, hopefully that will become clearer. And I'm also interested in how these tasks, sometimes we might ask ourselves, okay, so why has the academic in the unit or course set a critical review? What is its purpose and function? And so there'd be multiple reasons for that, but one of those would be when academics are doing the very intensive curriculum planning, often what they need to do is to do a constructive or curriculum alignment mapping document. And so every university has certain graduate attributes, and then part of the task of an assessment piece, among other things, is how does this contribute to particular graduate attributes? All right. So if we think about this, so it's obviously for writing critical reviews, it's a common requirement of postgraduate courses. So it does demonstrate comprehensive mastery and deep understanding of the concepts, content, methods, and theories of different disciplines and professions. So when we look at the examples, um, of, just a sneak previews from memory: accounting, education, health, international relations, science and technology. I might have left one out. But when we look at those, we will actually see people referring to commonly accepted and understood concepts, content, methods, and theories of those respective professions and disciplines. So that's part of what you're showing understanding of. But precisely because of that distinctiveness, it can indeed be challenging to demonstrate this specialized knowledge and to exhibit familiarity with its generic structure, while also developing your evidence-based argument and point of view. Now, one of the things that we will be looking at, and Alison highlighted this really helpfully at the end of the previous workshop, is evidence and how we engage with and analyze evidence and what that looks like in our different disciplines and so on. So we will be coming back to that. All right, so hopefully you will agree with this, that there are some well-proven techniques and diverse examples of balancing these competing requirements. All right, and that was what Alison put together. I admire Alison's ability to distill down all of those words for the abstract, and then here she is creating 3 dot points that really sum it up much better. So we will be looking at thinking critically and what does that look like. We'll be looking at examining and evaluating a published work and what does that look like, and also about writing. How do you go about writing? All right, now when we talk about excellent, it's, it can be considered high quality or first class, but really for me it's about being effective. It's about being fit for purpose. It's about being quality in the sense that it does what it says that it's going to do. And of course, hopefully it inspires us to do the best that we can, despite acknowledging the limitations, such as the word count of a piece and so on. All right, so getting into the essence of the workshop then. So defining critical reviews. Now, it's interesting, just a word about the sources. That's the exception, this one, which is the British Chartered Institute of Personnel and Development. I just liked their definition. But all of the other resources are from Australian universities, which do, on the whole, a terrific job at supporting students at all levels to engage with these kinds of materials. So I do have a couple of, quartile 1 journal article, one anyway, sorry. But mostly the resources that I think are most useful for this come from, whether it's called the Student Support Centre or the Writing Centre or whatever it might be called, some terrific resources there. Okay, so the Chartered Institute of Personnel and Development in the UK this year, when an academic assignment asks you to critically review or include a critical analysis, it generally means you'll need to think critically, which was in the dot points for today. Okay, this means engaging with what the author was trying to achieve, the approach they took, how they conducted the research, and whether the outcomes were valid and acceptable. And I'll come back a little bit later to words like valid and reliable and so on. I don't want to get into be distracted by a semantic discussion, but fundamentally the point there is it's the criteria that really relate to your discipline and profession that you're going to bring to bear to see whether what you're reviewing contributes to, aligns with knowledge in that profession and discipline. And I guess the other point about that is that this is a good time to acknowledge that that knowledge, that those understandings in a discipline or profession, sometimes they're accepted, sometimes basically there's consensus. But very often, particularly because these are often driven by academics who disagree profoundly about all kinds of things, often the knowledge base is contested, or certain aspects of it are contested. And there are different views about what works at policy level and in practice and that kind of thing. So that's actually a really good thing, because rather than thinking that this is monolithic, that there's only one right way to think about these things, which is actually a good definition of totalitarianism in some ways, rather it's saying there are different views about these things. And whether that's professional procedures or professional ethics or whatever it might be. But anyway, it's about thinking critically and what that looks like. And so the critical review evaluates the strengths and weaknesses. It assesses the item's value, and that's really important. And often it's a report, a book, maybe a book chapter or a journal article, although it can be about really almost about anything, so-called grey literature, which can be policy documents, or they can be an institution's repository or archive, or whatever it might be. All right. Now, just before we, and I'm sure you know this anyway, but this point about being critical, with the examples that I've assembled, there's only one, which is the very last one, and I thought twice about whether to include it. That is what I would consider overtly critical, or critical in the common, the common parlance. Oh, you're being very critical today about the way I'm dressed, or or what I'm eating, or whatever it might be. As we know, in a critical review, by contrast, what is required is something that's more measured, that's really getting into the significance or the intentions and effects of an item or a document or whatever it might be. Anyway, we'll come to that shortly. All right, so it's about summarizing and evaluating a text. It's about reading the text in detail. And this is crucial, obviously, reading other related texts so that you can present a fair and reasonable evaluation of the selected text. So it's partly so that you can have a fair and reasonable evaluation, but I think it's also so that you can put the text in a broader perspective. And that's really what it's about. So that also makes the point with critical reviews that any single text is not an island entire to itself. It's actually part of a set of discourses, or it's part of a set of practices, policies and practices, and so on. And it's how does it relate to, align with, differ from, contest other texts in that same field, or in related fields. All right, now in terms of being critical, it actually asks you to question the information and opinions in a text and present your evaluation or judgments of the text. And this term judgment or judgments is really important, I think. And so whether you're doing a postgrad master's with or coursework, whether you're doing a postgrad master's with a supervised project, or whether you're doing a full thesis, you still need to develop and demonstrate the capacity for judgment. And we'll come from a number of angles of what that looks like. But one of those things is to, where appropriate, to make explicit your position, or positionality, sometimes it's called, your assumptions, your values, your viewpoint. Or maybe it's about the viewpoint of the the professional unit that you belong to, or the discipline, or whatever it might be. And so this is about attempting to understand the topic from different perspectives, okay, and also to understand the theories, approaches and frameworks in your course. And so if we think about why do academics assign critical reviews, that's another reason, apart from graduate attributes, it is a really efficient way to see whether students have actually engaged with, understood, assimilated, contested, whatever, the theories, approaches and frameworks in that particular course of study. This is from the University of New South Wales, really helpful. Okay, now what's meant by evaluation or judgment? You decide the strengths and weaknesses of a text. I'm a little bit ambivalent about the weaknesses. That's probably the word limitation is probably a better word, but even there, you can still be critical in this sense and analytical about a text that is actually, in terms of like being, if we think about a journal article, okay, so a journal article passes muster typically by peer review, by going through that peer review process, and two or three, at least, sometimes more, two or three people who don't know the author and the author doesn't know the reviewers provide their own review, their own critical review of the manuscript. Now, some people are very lucky. I've never had this, but some people are very fortunate and big tick, this is brilliant, no changes, publish tomorrow. Most of us languish in a review process that can take months or even years, and that's another story. But we could imagine that an article is fully peer reviewed and it's published even in a quartile 1 journal, which is supposedly the top quality journals. But it can still be critiqued. So, it's fulfilled the requirements to be published in the journal, but it can, and therefore it may not have what we might see as overt weaknesses, but there can still be gaps there, maybe limitations, but we can still say, well, it achieves this part of it, of the purpose, but it says nothing. It's silent about this other aspect of a topic, and really it should have engaged with that in some way, just as an example. So the criteria for reviewing, undertaking the critical review, lie at the heart of your evaluation and judgment. And also to understand, and some of these points are repetitive, but I don't mind that, because to me that's a process of reinforcing some of the key points that the key features really of a critical review. So an understanding of a text purpose, the intended audience, and why it's structured the way it is. Okay. And then in terms of analysis, separating the content and concepts of a text into their main components, and then understanding how these interrelate, connect, and possibly influence each other. Now, before I was looking at a graphic of Bloom's taxonomy, the very old version, the cognitive domains, even though it's quite we might say aged, or we might say seminal, I still find it useful. And in some ways, it's a bit of an artificial separation between, say, description and analysis and interpretation. And then for Bloom, going up to synthesis and then to evaluation. And then that was changed, and other taxonomies came along and so on. But I guess the point is that and we'll see these in the examples when we come to look at them, you still need description. You need to describe to someone who hasn't read the work or is not familiar with it, you need to describe what is going on. And that's often the purpose of summarizing. So summarizing is where you make the call about what are the important features. Obviously, that's bound by word count, particularly. And so whether that's 50 words or 100 or 250 words or whatever it is, that's all the space that you've got to describe, to summarize, to explain what is going on. Then, depending on the way that your assessment piece is structured, then, and I accept that this is a bit of an artificial description, you might then come into analysis. So you've described what's happening, what are the main elements and so on, and then you analyze them. And as it says there, analysis is particularly about bringing in other elements that lie outside the text. And then logically, you would often have some kind of an evaluation or a judgment. So from these perspectives, or based on these criteria, this text contributes new knowledge to this field. However, in relation to X and Y, the author is silent on these points, or what the author has presented has been not just supplemented but superseded by subsequent research findings by other researchers, that kind of thing. All right, so if we look at the engaging of the selected text, and this is from the Australian National University, so it's useful to have a look at. Now, again, obviously, you're going to consider really carefully what are the requirements of the piece in your assessment item required by the academic or academics working with you. So some of these may not apply, they might be in a separate order, there might be others that aren't here, but roughly ANU is saying, look at the objectives. What does the article set out to do? And so typically with a critical review, you start with the author or authors. You start with the text, and only after that do you move out and see what else do you need to think about. So what are the objectives? What does it set out to achieve? Is there an explicit theoretical or conceptual framework? Are there any kinds of assumptions put forward? Now, typically people don't use that language as such, but you can often discern and infer really important fundamental assumptions on the part of the author or authors, often in the introduction to the piece, because they're trying to set the scene and they're trying to link this piece with the rest of the field. And so it's important for them to put forward. So part of their assumption might be to say, there's a continuing debate in this field about this issue. Various previous authors have aligned themselves to different kinds of positions in this debate. In this text, we align ourselves with this particular part of the debate or the position or whatever it might be. All right, what are the central concepts? Are they clearly defined? Really importantly, what's the central argument? Are there specific hypotheses? There may be, but there may not be. But even without hypotheses, hopefully there's some kind of a proposition or a thesis statement or an argument that you can actually get hold of. One of the most difficult types of pieces to review critically is one that's not well written. And the reason that I say that is that typically with well-written pieces, we know where the author stands. We know what the point of the text is and so on. So we might think it's easy to criticize or to critique a piece if there's an absence of such an argument, and that's fair enough. But I would think that you could spend your time more profitably and productively looking at well-constructed pieces, well-crafted pieces, to see what do they contribute, and then how can we build on those for further work. What methods, whether they're research methods or whatever. Now, this was Alison's point as well. What evidence is provided? How adequate is it? And, there are lots of criteria for assessing evidence and so on. And there are also some assumptions about that. Okay, what now? Values. And when we talk about values, value positions, sometimes people, that varies. And quite often values, like maybe theory or concepts or whatever, are implicit rather than explicit. But for instance, in education, which is my field, the article for education that I've got relates to online teaching and learning and online assessment. And one of the positions referred to in that article is the assumption by many, maybe most people working in feedback, educational feedback, to have a learner-centered view of feedback. So that's an example of a value position, that educational feedback should be learner-centered. Like a lot of value positions, when we actually scratch the surface and get down into it, sometimes we find it's more complicated than that, because most institutions would claim to be learner-centered, but actually the assessment very rarely is negotiated. Things are predetermined that students come in and complete. Now, I'm not necessarily being critical of that, but I'm using that as one example of a value position that could be contested. All right, how does the work fit within the wider literature? What contribution does the work make to advancing our knowledge of the subject? How clear is the author's language, and so on? And then a brief overall assessment. All right, so I was talking before about summarizing and paraphrasing and so on. Now, again, apologies if this is all, you know this ad infinitum and so on, but I think it is worthwhile to go back and have a quick look. So the best way to summarize, scan the text. Now, sometimes it's interesting, people forget that, but actually it's really important. I think about that as being like the helicopter view. You're looking at the text, you're getting an idea, what are the elements without doing the deep dive reading that will follow. And that's really important to give you an idea of what is about, what's its overall length, what are the things, even in terms of the structure, the stylistics. So the size of the headings and what the headings consist of can be really informative and so on. So scan the text, locate the topic sentences, highlight the main points as you read. Of course, that's making an assumption that there are topic sentences and that there are main points. Hopefully they are there. Otherwise, it's going to be difficult to analyze it and so on. And then reread the text and make separate notes of the main points. Examples and evidence do not need to be included. Usually they're used selectively in your critique. So some people would do that as a separate process. Some people would do that, they would be aware of it as a separate process, but they would do it at the same time as the paraphrasing, which is fine as well. So obviously paraphrasing is putting in your own words and so on. That's really important as well, because among other things, what that does is that it shows your understanding of the material. And so it's actually really difficult to paraphrase something that is not clear to you. And so if I were trying to paraphrase biochemistry text or a piece of astrophysics or something like that, I wouldn't have a clue. And so a lot of my paraphrasing would be, well, what does this word mean in the broader context of this sentence, and so on. So there's an assumption with paraphrasing that you understand the fundamental points, and here's your opportunity to re-engage, in a sense, to reconstruct the text. Not quite in your own image, I don't really mean that, but making sense of it on your terms. And that's very important as part of a critical review, because if you don't do that, or you're not able to do that, it's actually still what you're writing is still from the point of view of what has been written. And I think that this is a timely reminder that actually they're different texts. You're not simply summarizing, you're not simply taking the words, lots of different words, not exactly quoted directly from the text. You're actually making it into your own. So review your summary notes, rewrite them in your own words and in complete sentences. Again, sorry if you know this already, use reporting verbs and phrases. The author describes, Smith argues that, etc. And then use quotation marks, and I put in sparingly, if you include unique or specialist phrases from the text. And the reason that I've added sparingly is that, of course, it's appropriate, particularly if there are certain elements of the original text that you do feel that you need to quote in the original. They're expressed in a certain kind of way that paraphrasing, it would almost like be the meaning being lost in translation, that kind of thing. But as we know, what the people assessing your work, your critical reviews, don't want is basically a lot of quoted material with occasional input from you. All right. Okay, so this is from the University of New South Wales. So in terms of what they've got is four general criteria for evaluating texts. So as you get into this, you don't have to use all of these questions or any of these focus questions. I think though it's interesting to have a look at them because they're really useful to help you to break down what it is as you're working through your critical review, what it is you're seeking to do. So these focus questions are designed to help you really to get to grips with the text and the critical review process. So I won't go through all of them, but just indicatively. So for the significance and the contribution to the field, which we may see as being the most important criterion, what's the author's aim? To what extent has this been achieved? What does this add to the body of knowledge from those different perspectives? What relationship does it bear to other works? Really crucially, what is missing, not stated, and is this a problem? Now, what is missing, not stated could be used in a devil's advocate kind of way to criticize anything. We could criticize any text and say, well, it's got these things, but it doesn't have these. Of course, the key thing is, if we say something is missing or not stated, we are also saying that it's something that should have been included or at least acknowledged in some way. And so that kind of concentrates the mind. Is this a problem? Because what that does is that it puts the onus back on you to say, well, okay, if it had been included or acknowledged, what would I have expected to see there? And what is the effect of its absence? How does that maybe diminish the comprehensiveness of the work or its relevance to today? So as we know, sometimes the texts that we're critically reviewing are historical documents, which might be from 10 years ago, not 500 years ago, but from a previous era and so on. So that could actually be quite interesting if what you're seeking to do is to use that text from 10 or 20 years ago, for instance, say again in education, with special needs education, in terms of the terminology, that has changed substantially, as I'm sure many of you, or maybe all of you know, even over the last 2 to 3 decades. And so the language that was used 10 years ago or 15 or 20 years ago, in that example, we might read some of those papers now and actually find them offensive. We might be troubled by them because of the apparent assumptions and value positions and propositions that they evoke. Now, we could certainly comment on that. At the same time, it would be appropriate to say that we have to avoid anachronism and presentism, assigning present values and vocabulary and language and so on to previous eras. And all of that just really reinforces how complex all of this is. All right, so methodology, what approach? There are lots of different ways, methodologies, as we know. Now, how objective biased is the approach? Because of my own position as a qualitative researcher, I tend to be ambivalent about that question, but there are certainly occasions when I could say that a text is biased. And there may well be that objectivity is a positive value and so on. Similarly with valid and reliable, this is not about being sidetracked by vocabulary, but for me, valid and reliable I accept that qualitative research can be considered valid and reliable, but I'm also aware that these days a lot of qualitative research and indeed some quantitative research would use other kinds of adjectives like authentic or resonant or credible or those kinds of things. So I guess rather than being bogged down in terminology, it's applying the criteria that relate to your discipline or profession. All right, and then the argument on the use of evidence. Is there a clear problem statement or hypothesis? Really important, what claims are made and what evidence does the text rely on, and how valid and reliable, how authoritative, How convincing, how credible is that evidence? How effective is that evidence in supporting the argument? What conclusions are drawn? Are these conclusions justified? So again, you may not have the space or the time to have all of those focus questions, but I think they are useful as looking at one way to approach this task. And the writing style and text structure, it is appropriate to comment on that, particularly around intended audience. So is it expert, non-expert, academic, non-academic, etc. And really crucially, how effective is that writing style? Does it communicate its meaning clearly and unequivocally? And then what's the organizing principle of the text? Could it be better organized, and so on? All right. Okay, so now we get into the examples of from different disciplines and so on. So again, my apologies, there's a lot of text, and it's not intended that you read this in great detail. It may be, if you're interested, I'll send the PowerPoints to Alison afterwards, and she's kind of going to load up the YouTube clip and so on. But it's more about when we look at these, what are the disciplinary differences in how these people have gone about doing critical reviews in these different disciplines and professions? And all that I've done is a bit like a couple of slides earlier. I've looked for the key words or the the topic sentences, that kind of thing. So from accounting, which is not my field at all, but it's the influence of culture on accountants' ethical decisions in Singapore and Australia from the year 2000. Okay, so this is a critical review, an example of that, and it says, okay, so looking at the research, this paper, which drew on, and many people would be very familiar with Hofstede's framework and so on around intercultural communication and competence and so on. And so this research aimed ... The study reveals ... The result agreed with the prediction made in earlier work and also by the authors of this piece, since considerable differences existed between these two dimensions. However, the results of the other dimensions provided less clear relationships, as the two cultural groups differed only slightly. Okay, and then to the extent that this research is exploratory, results of this study provide insights into, etc. However, several limitations must be considered in interpreting the study's finding. I consider that a really well-balanced review, critical review. It's fair, it's reasonable, it says what the study or the piece, the research aimed to achieve. It acknowledges what the findings were. It acknowledges the alignment between the result and the prediction. It also highlights that there were other dimensions where there were less clear relationships. And as we know in research, that's quite likely to happen because life is messy, research is messy, it's not always very clear cut and so on. And so again, fairly balanced results of this study, and however, there are several limitations. Now the numbers are on the next slide, and I think the numbers are interesting because they're things like reporting verbs that we talked about before, presents the aim purpose of the article. Transition signals provide structure and coherence. Reviewer's judgment. Conclusion summarizes reviewer's judgment. Modality offers recommendations, concessive clauses. Now, you may not want or even be able to include all of those, but I think it does repay, even if accounting is not your field. I think this does repay going back and having a closer look at how the author has structured the text. So the current study is still far from being conclusive. Further studies must be undertaken, better measures and larger samples. Despite some deficiencies in methodology, nevertheless, the study has provided some insights to account for culture. Now, we might say that that's too measured. And, you might say, come on, what do you really think about this? But in terms of the generic structure of a critical review and also a generic structure linked with accounting, I think it serves its purpose. All right, so if we look at education. Now, one of the things that I liked about this was that it's it's basically a review article. So in some ways it's a literature review. But the reason that I wanted to include this here was that I think that the authors have done a really interesting job that may be helpful to you in a critical review now or in the future. It may not. But what happened was that these authors, who are very experienced in terms of educational technology and particularly online learning and teaching, particularly in university settings, they reviewed a number of seminal works in the literature and so on. And so they looked at the technologies, but they also said conceptual work on online feedback has not followed. So that's a gap. This paper investigates how online learning researchers understand feedback's role in teaching and learning, gleaned from other people's studies. And what they did was they conducted a qualitative analysis of the language used about feedback in leading research journals. So it is that kind of bigger literature review. But here is the thing that I found really interesting. We identified 6 distinct understandings of feedback based on 6 dominant conceptual metaphors. Feedback is a treatment, it's a costly commodity, it's coaching, it's a command, it's a dialogue, and a learner tool. So if particularly, maybe if you're writing a thesis, but maybe also in coursework, if there's more scope within your critical review, you may want to look at this idea about, identifying metaphors or potentially identifying themes or that kind of thing. So for broader pieces, that can be really helpful. And if we look at this here, we identified 6 distinct understandings of feedback based on 6 metaphors. That in itself is a contribution to knowledge. So sometimes people think that critical reviews are, more limited in terms of contributing to knowledge, but here is clear evidence that that's not the case. This is a really useful paper that contributes directly to the literature. By doing this. So something to think about. So each of these metaphors offers a coherent frame of entailments related to roles and responsibilities of instructors and learners. And so on, the paper proposes that researchers interrogate their own conceptualizations, a more deliberate use of metaphors when conceptualizing feedback and driving the work on feedback in online learning forward. Now, this was just taken from their abstract. In the actual article itself, they did critically review the various papers that they had assembled. But if we just look at this final paragraph, particularly the last couple of lines, there's a value proposition there. So these authors believe very strongly that it's important that feedback is intrinsically valuable and important, that there is a continuing gap in online learning literature about feedback, and so it's important to drive this work forward. So if you were critically reviewing their article, which is a critical review of other articles, then that could be a useful point of engagement. And you might agree with that and accept that, or you might say, well, let's look at that a bit further. Why has equivalent work not yet been done on feedback? What's the problem? What are the difficulties? All right, so conscious of the time, but we'll keep going. So with health, so this is about nursing theory and so on. And so this is from obviously quite some time ago now, but it was used by Federation University in one of their learning centres. And so if we look at an example of an introduction to a critical review, and again, we've just looked at the keywords. Silver's paper argues, this review identifies the strengths and limitations and chronicles how the evaluation criteria have been refined since its publication. Well, I would hope that that's the case, given that was 1986. But I'm not diminishing what they've said. I think that's fine. How philosophy affects the testing of nursing theory and reflects on philosophical issues to show that ... The paper argues that the claims made by the author are, and end with your overall conclusion about that. So I think that if we just look at that as a sample or exemplar introduction. It's not very long. It's clearly an introduction, and clearly it ends with a proposition, an argument, a thesis statement. In terms of the summaries, so well, we talked about this before, Silver's paper argues for increased clarity. She achieves this clarity by delineating the evaluation criteria. What I've underlined here are really useful ways, and again, apologies if you do this by second nature. The second point of Silver's article, the third main claim, she provides evidence. Those are all really useful textual devices for moving the discussion on, but for also showing that you've got a really clearly structured approach to the critical review. You've got X number of points that you want to make, and you're making them progressively. Here's critique. Now, this one you might want to use. I like this. Oh, sorry, I'm so excited. One of the strengths of Silver's article is also one of its limitations. So if we think about that, if you're writing a critical review, could you use that in relation to what you're critically reviewing? I think it's interesting. So, okay, so the strength of the formative evaluation criteria, but the limitation, presumably they're interesting to consider and so on. And with 7, there'd be a fair degree of variety there. On the other hand, in terms of limitations, these same 7 criteria need far more precision and scope than that given in the paper. The author seems unaware of these developments and so on. Evidence from other sources shows. So this is where you bring in other pieces and so on. Now, you may be comfortable writing that, and that's very effective as a point of critique. Or you may want to say that what Silver contributes is useful. We need also to consider these other sources and so on. Okay, so the degree to which the results may have differed may have been compromised. And then a third limitation, only one approach to the testing of nursing theory was described. This seriously limits that. Okay, and then the conclusion. This review argues that Silver's article fails to make a significant contribution. It's worth reading to get clear understanding of so despite this, it is worth reading. So that's damning it with faint praise, I guess. Even though it's from 1986, by the sound of it, the reviewer does not think it's still seminal work, but it is worth reading. So that's good. And this bodes well for the advancement of nursing science and the future of nursing. Okay. Now, again, apologies. I'm conscious of the time. I'll finish up in the next few minutes. It's not about reading this in detail, although I think the color coding is interesting. Now, this was used by the Academic Skills Office at the University of New England. And so if we just have a quick look at this, I think the color coding is interesting. So yellow, it could be any color, of course. Yellow, references to the text. Pinkish purple, probably more pink, evaluative language. Green, organizing principle. Grey, light grey, evidence type, sky blue, I guess, words and rhetorical moves of author, and then darker grey is in-text citations. And so those are interesting because, and there might be others that you want to put in, but they're your way to do that deep dive into the text so that no one can say that you haven't actually engaged in great detail with the text. And then if we just look around down the right-hand column, these are the kinds of things that we would hope the review would be doing, your review would be doing. So uses descriptive language to judge, appraise the text, summarizes the author's main argument, provides a brief outline summary, and so on, positively appraises the text. Now, there's a logic to this kind of generic structure it goes through. As the text goes on, you start to become more evaluative. So evaluates the author's argument, signals a shift from summarizing and positively appraising to a negative appraisal, or to a critique, we might say. Evaluates the argument evidence, uses descriptive language. Okay. Evaluates the argument evidence furthermore, presents counter evidence, which is a really interesting strategic move. And then at the end, again, evaluates the text, summarizes, provides a final assessment of the possible influence of the text. Sorry, that's in international relations. All right, and then with law, this is interesting because this is not strictly speaking a critical review, but it makes the point that each discipline understandably has has discipline specific expectations. And so if you're doing a critical review in law, really what you would pick up would be a lot of references to case, if it's appropriate, obviously, to case law, to previous decisions and judgments and their significance. And then as a non-lawyer, I'm always very impressed by the precision, the conciseness, the drilling down to the essence when, as we know, these things can be incredibly complicated and you've got different interests at play. So I found that really interesting to look at. Take reasonable care, the club's neighbours, reasonable care to avoid foreseeable risks of injury, and then it can be readily concluded. So that's a very law-like way to summarize the review, and that's entirely appropriate. And then science and technology, and this is the last one, just a couple of examples. So Atkinson has written a press book, which means it's fully available, download to anyone with internet access. And I've got the reference at the end. So it's really worthwhile looking at. And it's about, as I recall, it's about critical reviewing and critical writing more broadly. But anyway, so science and technology and engineering and so on, following principles favored by economists, by reviewing other research studies using a simulation model, they find a carbon tax not only works, the exact mechanism is not, however, the exact mechanism is not yet understood. A different example, a different text from Atkinson, and so many have lost sight of the full richness of human intelligence and have neglected to separate foundational understanding from engineering. Okay, distinguished machine learner insider. Jordan speaks with authority. I think this is the first time we've seen this in these examples, but it's worthwhile if you consider it relevant. So the Atkinson is aware of Jordan's work and calls Jordan a distinguished machine learning insider. Now that would not be gleaned from this particular text, but Atkinson obviously is aware of Jordan's authority within the discipline and so on. And a counterexample, why I won't buy an iPad and think you shouldn't either, this is the one I hesitated about. So Dr. O is a software creator, so he has something personal to gain from unconstrained digital media sharing. The author overlooks the iPad's beneficial applications. Just because the iPad does not work for Dr. O does not mean it will not work for others. So again, the language might not be appropriate to your discipline critical reviews, but the underlying idea is an interesting one. All right, I really do encourage you. There are lots of examples. It's amazing how many other strategies are out there and so on. And I just wish all of you well with all of that. Thanks so much, and thanks for your patience.
Okay, thanks, Patrick. Some excellent examples there from different disciplines. Lakshitha, you've put a comment in the chat box. Are you happy? Can you explain your question a little further for us, for Patrick? Oh, I think she jumped out instead of putting her mic on. Oh, no, you're there. Good. Can you put your mic on? And so your comment is in the chat box, how is constructive feedback about assignment? So I'm not sure, we're sort of seeking some clarity on that question.
Okay, interesting. How do we reflect it, or reflect on the feedback you get? Is that what you mean? Okay. Actually, it's a really good question, isn't it? If I'm assessing a critical review, what am I looking at? So similarly, I've got the criteria to look at. And so I would be I'm not sure what your discipline is, Akshita, but within the discipline, I would be looking for evidence that you've clearly read the text, that you've engaged with it, you've understood it, you've made sense of it, and you've critiqued it in the sense that you've made some evaluative comments and education. Okay, good, thank you. Okay, so within that field, and particularly given that's your field, and as we know, it's really a crucial field, but it's also a challenging field, very complex. I would be interested to see how you've linked it with your own experience and knowledge. So for instance, it may be that what you're critically reviewing gives you new knowledge to frame your work in that field, for instance. And so it gives you, I don't know, some new strategies, or or potentially, hypothetically, it might make you really angry because it's written in complete ignorance of early childhood educators and all the work that they have to do. And so that might motivate you to write a response piece or something like that. But sometimes when we review a piece, it can help to affirm the value of our work, not particularly as individuals, but the field that we work in. I get really, and I'm sure we all do, I'm sure Alison does, sure we all do, I get very irritated when people write about education who have absolutely no notion, no understanding. And it's all about the holidays and all of this kind of stuff. And of course it's not. It's far more transforming and empowering than that. By contrast, if something, for instance, helps me to understand the contemporary work of educators, including early childhood educators, and gives me new insights, I think, wow, that's really good. So I don't know if that answers your question, but it's interesting to see. The feedback should be part of continuing our learning process.
Okay, gave us the thumbs up there. Okay, great. Are there any other questions? We can go a little bit more over time, or comments or discussion you'd like to raise while we've got Patrick still with us. Thanks, Zach. Great session.
Zach, I think you're a masochist. Too short.
Now I need to critically review my own critical review. Well, that's right. Oh, great. Thanks, Dennis. Very valuable presentation. Yes, go right ahead, Rohit. Please, we're okay for going over a few minutes.
So... Thank you, Alison. Oh yeah,
yeah.
Hi Patrick. I just want to ask you one question.
Sure.
So yeah, I really like the presentation today. I don't think I can apply that unless I have a unit that I'm studying, a unit specifically asking for critical review. Mm-hmm. So my question is this: how do we improve our critical analyzing skills in our everyday life? Like, can you give me examples of how, as students, we can do that?
Sure. Okay. So one example, which may not apply to you, Rohit, I'm not sure, but one example can apply to work situations, where we may find ourselves confronted with something that is an ethical dilemma, or it's really complex, or we see examples of behavior that we think, that's not really what it should be. And so these analytical skills can be useful in the sense that it can help us to understand and to reflect what's going on here. What are people's different interests? What are they trying to achieve? And also, am I misunderstanding the situation? So that's a very applied example. But I do think that a lot of the principles are the same. So what are people's value propositions? So just a very quick example. Some of the people I've worked with over the years are in roles where, I don't know if people are familiar with Little Britain and so on. And there's that wonderful example of the computer says no. And so there are some people who are really rules-based in their approach to work. Now, I understand that we need that. We need rules and so on. But I also understand that sometimes we work in complex environments where the effects of a too literal application of rules actually leads to bad outcomes. And so I find it interesting trying to work in situations to bring about good outcomes, typically for students, that are entirely legal and entirely ethical, but that sometimes one of the barriers is people who say, no, well, no, the policy says this. So then we say, but who created the policy? And when was it created? And in whose interest was it created? And why is it like that? And does it have to be like that? And should we review it? So I'm sorry if that seems an irrelevant example, but for me, it's actually a good example, because they're the same processes of of analysis, of trying to understand different points of view, sometimes a number of different points of view, and then trying to navigate our way through it. But apologies, Rod, if that has nothing to do with your situation.
Okay.
Okay, thanks, Rod.
Thanks.
You're a kind person. Thank you.
Any other comments? I've just got a little. Thanks, Ewan. I just got, when you were talking about, assessing literature, when I was a research student, getting my head around Foucault.
Oh, yes.
And it's a classic example as an English speaker, trying to get my head around what is a landmark, well-respected master in the field I was researching, which social history of institutions. So it's like, your supervisors go, oh, go and read Foucault, and it's like, oh my gosh. So what's interesting about that in terms of critical review, he was not writing in English. It's worth understanding what is the writer's original language. So his work is translated. So that means there's someone in the middle between the author and the reader who is translating. So that can be, I know there's expert translators, of course, but things don't always translate directly from one language to another. So just thinking critically about Foucault, and then spending weeks, months, and just trying to get a decent couple of sentences in my literature review about how Foucault is relevant to my study. Then to realize that Australian English students had access to a 1968 abridged translated version. Now, abridged means parts left out. So, this is thinking critically, isn't it? To recognize that it is translated, that it is abridged, meaning there's not the full version is there. And also to understand French writing, especially from the 60s, was very kind of flowery and descriptive and not very to the point. So, so that's just a way to think critically about Foucault. And then like years later, 30 years later, someone said, oh, here's the original, not the original, of a non-abridged translated version.
Right.
And then everyone starts critique, when you said fights within academia, then everyone's up in arms because look at all that stuff the original translator left out. Anyway,
okay.
do you know what I mean? From the abridged version to when the full version came out. Anyway, there's a big story there.
Yes.
But that's just one way of thinking critically. Is it a translated abridged version that you're reading?
Yes.
Anyway.
It's a great example, and thanks so much for sharing, Alison. And partly, of course, critical review of Foucault is almost like saying he's a god. Who are we to who are we to critically review him or any of the other?
Right. And as a student, you've got to include something in my area. I had to acknowledge him.
Yeah, of course, yes. But it's a really interesting example. So as you say, lost in translation, but also the different time period. And the same applies to Bourdieu and some of these other particularly French theorists, writing about French society in the 60s and 70s and 80s. And how relevant is that to Australia in, the 2000s? But also, it's interesting, Alison, because I did look at Foucault for my thesis and then moved on. And the reason for that is it's also part of critical review, because he tends to focus on, as you said, institutions, the military, the asylums, the schools, the church, and so on. And I just find his work really depressing because, in terms of structure and agency, he focuses at the macro level. And what I've realized is that I'm much more interested in the micro level of agency. So sure, we have to acknowledge all of that out there. But
you have to acknowledge the masters that have
gone before. Yes. But also, what do people do on the ground at the micro level in the face of these seemingly overwhelming odds? And so, there's a lot of critique of Foucault that he didn't actually engage with that at all.
No.
So, so it's a great example. I really appreciate you raising that, Alison.
Okay. I think I'm still getting my head around Foucault.
Yes. It's a life project.
All right. Any last questions for Patrick or comments? I think it was a very fruitful workshop. Thank you so much, Patrick.
Thank you.
Just having those sort of keywords underlined, people can kind of use those, phrases to kind of get their own critical review started.
Sure.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
All right. Has everyone gone quiet? Is it time for morning tea?
Sounds good.
All right. Well, thanks so much for your time. Actually, before we go, I just want to say that Patrick will be back again next week, next Thursday, the 10th, and he's going to do another workshop with us. And this time it's writing an excellent conceptual framework in qualitative research. Yes. So I might just quickly post the info and the link for that if you want to come back and join us again. And yes, I will email Patrick's slides probably later today. But yeah, I've put in the chat box there if you want to join us again. It'll be next Thursday, the 10th. Okay, already registered. Well done, Zach. We'll see you there. Okay, thanks for your time, everyone.
Thanks, bye.